we are going to remain a party that is able to oppose, is able to hold the government to account. That includes in Parliament and in parliamentary committees. We do acknowledge that we want committees to work.
The NDP leader today, again, defending his decision to enter into a deal with the Liberals to support them until 2025 and maintaining his party can still hold the government to account. But how does that work? And does this deal move the political middle, the centre in this country? It's Thursday. I'm here with At Issue again this week. Chantal Hebert, Andrew Coyne, and Elamin Abdelmahmoud. Althia is away this week. Andrew, I'm going to start with you on this question because it's sort of the one I had left after we talked on Tuesday. How does the NDP manage to be an effective opposition party when they have this deal now with the Liberals? Is it possible?
It's possible, and there's nothing wrong in principle, we should say from the outset, with one or more parties, forming a majority by alliance rather than simply by winning a majority in the government. All that matters from the standpoint of responsible government is that the government controls a majority of the support of the MPs in the House. It doesn't matter whether it's one party or two or 12. But that being said, majority governments don't have a great track record from the standpoint of accountability. When the government controls a majority of the committees, it's really hard for the opposition to really hold them to account. So the question is the NDP, as a valid supporter now of this government, at least on confidence votes, are its MPs going to act like Liberal MPs have, or indeed Conservative MPs when the Conservative was the government? Are they going to act like government-side MPs, or are they going to continue to try to hold the government to account? They say they will, but I think two questions come up. One of the ways in which opposition parties can register their unhappiness in committees is by filibustering, or indeed in Parliament. And that language about how we want to make these committees work, and there's language in the agreement about, we don't want to have obstructionism, doesn't suggest that they're really on board for that kind of tactic in the opposition party. And secondly, where the opposition can really hold a government to account, at least in the minority situation, is when they can threaten to vote no confidence in them. If the government is simply not listening to Parliament, not acknowledging Parliament's prerogatives, for example, in yielding the documents and witnesses that parliamentary committees ask of them, as we saw in the last Parliament. So I guess we're going to have to wait and see how the NDP MPs behave. There's nothing stopping them from being just as robust in holding the government to account as they were before, but remains to be seen whether that's their intention.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, as someone who covers committees, it is frustrating when there's a majority government, and it is frustrating for different reasons when there's a minority government, and sometimes things get stalled too. Chantal, and then Elamin.
I guess it's worth noting that the last time the NDP arrived at some agreement with the Liberal government, and not one that was as comprehensive, was when Paul Martin was Prime Minister, and Jack Layton co-wrote a new budget with the Liberals. But when the sponsorship scandal took real steam, that didn't prevent the NDP from bringing that government down. So that is what the past suggests. The other point, I guess, on committees is Andrew talks about, for instance, the documents on China that were not delivered. But I've checked, and in this Parliament, it was the Conservatives who stood down on the issue, as they stood down on the Canada-China Committee. So no one waited for the NDP to make a deal with the government to stand down. That being said, some of us on this panel like electoral reform, and electoral reform would almost certainly bring about hung parliaments, minority governments. And they would also bring about cooperation between parties that would create different kinds of majorities. So it's either one or the other. You get to decide.
Elamin.
I guess what I'm thinking about here is the difference between policy and ideology. So we can certainly at least agree that there are a lot of policies right now that the Liberals and the NDP could see eye to eye on, and that is good news for Canadians in terms of that getting done. But when you think about ideology, we think about the Liberal government, or at least the Liberal Party, as a party that at least sometimes like to think about fiscal guardrails, about fiscal anchors. This government has not been particularly inclined to have those thoughts because, again, we've been in a pandemic spending kind of environment. But the question then becomes, if down the road, not this budget, but maybe the budget after that or the budget after that, this government starts to think some austerity thoughts, starts to sort of think, start to be more inclined towards austerity because we have been spending quite a bit. Will the NDP continue to support them even through that? And I think that's what's unclear is sort of the ideological consequences of this, because one can't imagine the NDP wants to carry that particular flag into the next election.
Yeah, and to be fair, when I ask people, I understand what you agree on. What happens when you disagree? No one really gives me a very convincing answer about what happens in that instance. Yeah, Chantal.
Although you did see some example of what happens when you disagree this week over defense spending, and something the NDP is not keen on, which will still be happening, according to Jagmeet Singh, as long as that doesn't translate into cuts in social spending.
Yeah.
I don't think the NDP worries about wearing austerity from this government. I think the Liberals need to worry about wearing huge deficits from this arrangement.
Yeah, and that sort of brings me to the question about where this pushes the political spectrum. I mean, it feels like the centre isn't where it was before this deal, or maybe that had moved way long before this, Andrew.
I would say so. I think the center of gravity in Canadian politics is now somewhere on the right of center of the Liberal Party. That was true before this agreement, and I think it's true afterwards. In perception terms, however, when people are looking at the Liberal Party now in a formal arrangement with the NDP, does that change the way centrist voters start to look at the Liberal Party? Do they feel less comfortable with that? Because a lot of this is governed not just by actual policies, but by atmospherics and brand, et cetera. And that means that raises the question, is the center ground up for grabs? Can the Conservatives lay claim to it? And of course, that raises the further question, does the Conservative Party want to lay claim to it?
Yeah, Elamin?
But maybe we're romanticizing the idea of the center a little bit too much here. I mean, like we put the Liberals and the NDP together, we've got a little bit over half the population, and so like just by pure numbers, that is where the majority of Canadians are. And if we are to take that idea seriously and to take its consequences seriously, then that's the Canadians, at least for the past few elections, telling us that this idea of somewhere between the Liberals and the NDP and the push-pull between them, that is where the majority of Canadians are. And if you can concoct an agreement this time around, it may well prove profitable for the Liberals to keep doing this. Like we may end up in this situation again and again. And I'm not sure that's such a bad thing for Canadians.
Chantal, last word to you on this one.
Well, you need also to take into account that on many of the issues that those two parties agreed on, that wouldn't be news to anyone who voted for either the Liberals or the NDP, a number of Bloc voters are also on side. So when you talk about where the centre is, I don't really care where the centre is. The same voters who voted for Justin Trudeau in Ontario in the fall will, if Premier Ford is to win re-election with a majority, be voting for him.
The need to ensure that Europe's dependence on Russian oil and gas ceases, that Russia is punished with crippling sanctions, where at the same time we're able to pivot more quickly towards renewables.
An emergency or extraordinary meeting of NATO leaders and G7 leaders today on the ongoing war in Ukraine. Leaders recommitted to supporting Ukraine, but there were no real dramatic new measures announced. Though Trudeau, as you heard there, did suggest Canada's oil and wheat may be able to help support demand to some extent. Chantal, Andrew, and Elamin back for another round here. I pulled that clip just because I found that it's super interesting that the Prime Minister was making the suggestion that trying to wean Europe off oil and gas, Russia's oil and gas, might actually push nations to tackle climate change more quickly. And I don't know if that is true or fair or right even to be asking at this time, Chantal.
But that has been the conversation in Europe prior to Justin Trudeau's arrival for this latest meeting, that not only would more oil and gas be needed, but that transition needed to be sped up. I listened to the Prime Minister's comment with a thought to him preparing the ground possibly for a decision on a major Newfoundland and Labrador project, Beach Nord. It has to come soon. It will involve more fossil fuel production. And I think somehow maybe the Prime Minister was setting the ground for that.
That is a good point. Andrew?
there certainly is the case in the medium and long term for Europe and for all of us to be moving off of fossil fuels. But the time frame that we're looking at, if we're trying to be helpful to Ukraine and trying to rein in Russia right now, is much shorter than that. So in the short term, we do need to be doing whatever we can to provide Europe with oil and gas. We are limited to date in our capacity because of the degree to which we have sort of boxed ourselves in on pipelines. But whatever we can be doing now and in the future, in the short term, it should be directed, it seems to me, to be replacing oil and gas, not longer term objectives about moving off of oil and gas altogether.
Because it does seem as though that's sort of the holdout. I mean, in spite of the U.S. moving to shut down oil and gas into the United States, Europe can't do that overnight. And it does seem to be the one thing that would really cause an enormous amount of pain. I think most people agree, Elamin.
I mean, there's a real sense when you're listening to world leaders talk right now, and you say, what are you going to do now? And the answer is, well, we won't let this happen again in the future. And that's not a contradiction. It is literally the only answer that they can give, because in the current moment, the only thing that has to be addressed is whether the reliance on Russian energy continues to be as high as it has been over the last 6 years since they invaded Crimea. And now it's getting worse. And so I think when world leaders are sort of trying to solve this problem, they're trying to say, we will control for this, not happening in the future. But at the moment, all they can do is sort of be responsive, and there's very little they can do in this moment right now.
Should they, though, have, if they're going to convene a NATO meeting and everyone get together to listen to President Zelensky and show resolve, should they not have something to give or to offer at the end of it that is more substantive than what we saw today? Chantal?
Well, sometimes you need to think about whether you want to get your wish, because something more substantive than what you heard today might have been full-out war in Europe. And I do believe that is what the discussion is about, contingency plans for if it escalates. But whether you want to be the one escalating or whether public opinion would follow you down that path, I leave to the Europeans who are next to that to decide.
Andrew?
The best single thing that any of the countries can do for Ukraine is to provide it with weapons. But the course that has been pursued has been left to individual countries rather than a NATO decision. That's probably sensible from both an optics standpoint and from an internal domestic politics standpoint. The only thing that was discussed previously was, in terms of NATO, was some kind of no-fly agreement, and that simply is off the table. Nobody wants to go there.
Last word to you on this, Elamin.
I mean, I have to say that everything we're hearing from world leaders right now appears to be sort of trying to write foreign doctrines on the back of a napkin. And that makes sense, right? It is sort of a sort of ever-evolving situation where we're dealing with Vladimir Putin, who has not been particularly predictable. But what that means, at least in the short term, is until NATO can sort of agree on that broader strategy that avoids any signals that it's interested in any kind of war, we're going to be in limbo. And it's going to be, incremental steps that can maybe help Ukraine a little without aggravating Vladimir Putin. That's a really fine needle to thread. I would not want to be in that seat.
Okay, got to leave it there this week. Thank you for coming in twice. Appreciate it.